Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Mongabay's webinar series for journalists, broadcast to you live from YouTube and also on LinkedIn. I'm your host and moderator for today's discussion, Mike DiGirolamo. As I always do, I encourage you to subscribe to Mongabay's YouTube channel so you can be notified when this webinar is edited after we're done here today, and also when our next one is planned. So today's webinar topic is a really important one, and for a bit of context, according to a report by Global Witness over the past decade, an environmental defender has been killed every 2 days. And on top of that, reporting on the environment has become one of the most dangerous jobs in journalism. Online threats, intimidation, harassment, imprisonment, and death are just a few of the risks that defenders and journalists face. But there's a lot more complexity to this topic than I just mentioned, and it's why we're hosting a webinar on it today. Suffice it to say, we'll be talking about how reporters can cover the work of environmental defenders and also the legal, ethical, and safety considerations of doing so. I want to reiterate that what we say here on this webinar is not meant as an exhaustive list of everything you need to know. You should always work with the editorial team you are writing with when covering stories of a sensitive nature with any degree of risk by following their safety protocols and guidelines. We will be linking resources we recommend you view in addition to the material that we cover here today. Before we get into it, I want to remind you, if you'd like to stay on top of the latest opportunities and job openings at Mongabay, we encourage you to sign up for our occasional email newsletter, which you can find on the opportunities page at mongabay.org. As always, we're seeking your pitches, so if you have a story idea after reviewing today's discussion, please send us your idea via the corresponding topic under Special Reporting Projects, also on the opportunities page. But we also encourage you to pitch your idea to other outlets as well, if not to us. Just like in past discussions, our panelists will answer roughly 10 questions. At the conclusion of the hour-long session, we're going to open the floor to your questions, but I do want to stress that we may go a little bit longer on this panel today with some questions, so we may begin that audience Q&A just a little bit later. We have 4 wonderful guests today on our panel, and I'm happy to introduce them, starting with Milka Chepkorir. Based in Kitale, Kenya, Milka is a member of the Sengwer indigenous peoples of the Cherangani Hills in Kenya. For the last 6 years, she has been working for the recognition of her community's land rights. Formerly, Milka coordinated for the Community Land Action Now, a network of Kenyan rural communities striving to register their community lands in 2020. She was an environmental justice fellow at Natural Justice Kenya. And Milka has represented her community and presented on their issues in different UN processes and was an Indigenous Fellow at OHCHR in 2016. I would introduce her right now. It looks like that she's preparing her technical setup there, so I'll come back to you, Milka. Also joining us today is Rachel Cox. Rachel is the interim campaign leader on Land and Environmental Defenders at Global Witness, where she investigates and advocates for the rights and protection of land and environmental activists worldwide. She has led investigative projects with a focus on Asia that expose harm caused by governments and businesses linked to the exploitation of land and natural resources. The Defenders Campaign records and publishes globally recognized data on reprisals. Since July 2023, she has served as a member of the Board of Trustees for Peace Brigades International UK. You can follow her at Rachel_Cox01. Rachel, it's great to have you here. How you doing?
Hi, Mike. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. I'm looking forward to spending the next hour and a half with you. So, yeah.
And also joining us today is Maria Isabel Torres. Maria Isabel is the project manager at Mongabay Latam, Mongabay's Spanish language bureau. She has been an investigative journalist in politics and economics for mainstream and online media for over 15 years, and she has worked for the public sector and was part of the team who organized COP20 in Lima. She specializes in environmental issues such as climate change negotiations and illegal mining. Maria Isabel, great to have you.
Hello, Mike, and thank you for having me, and happy to talk about this important topic.
And we also have joining us Lucy Westcott. Lucy became director of CPJ's Emergencies Department in October 2021. That's the Committee to Protect Journalists. She oversees CPJ's assistance and safety work worldwide. Prior to joining CPJ as a James W. Foley Research Associate in 2018, She was a staff writer for Newsweek, reported for outlets including The Intercept, Bustle, The Atlantic, and Women Under Siege, and was a United Nations correspondent for the Interpress Service. Lucy, great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here.
So once more to reiterate, we're gonna give each panelist an opportunity to address each of the questions, and we'll be holding a 15-minute session at the end for your questions. So if you do have a question, don't wait. Go ahead and just drop it in that chat there, and then we're going to address it at the top of the hour. Just as a reminder, you're going to be able to view this entire webinar on demand on our YouTube channel within about 48 hours. Timestamps and any resources that we are sharing today will be included in that description. And if you registered, you'll be receiving a publication notice directly to your inbox along with a brief survey. And we will also publish a link to this webinar on the blog at mongabay.org. So we are going to go ahead and get started. And I'm just going to bring Milka in. Milka, how you doing? Can you hear us? All right, no worries. We'll come back to you. So the first question that I have here is regarding...
Yes, I can. And sorry, I'm joining you from Accra because I was in a function somewhere. Hi, and I'm happy to be here.
All right, how you doing? It's great to have you. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start with our first question. So our first question here is regarding who are we referring to when we speak about environmental defenders. So it's important to recognize that there's a wide variety of activists, scientists, indigenous communities and leaders, legal practitioners, and also journalists that face both physical and legal risks to their personal safety. So for the purposes of today's discussion, who are we referring to when we speak about environmental defenders? And anyone is free to go ahead and chime in with the question and with their answer.
So at Global Witness, a land environmental defender is anybody who takes peaceful action to protect people's rights to the land and the environment, either in a personal capacity or as part of a job. So our definition differs to other organizations, but for us, this covers a really broad range of people, ordinary people often, who have raised concerns about environmental damage, climate change, land grabs, and connected to that, their human rights. Often, they are combating business activities in some form, but essentially a defender can be anyone from a grandmother questioning pollution to a lawyer assisting communities against polluting projects, right down to indigenous communities who, as we found in our statistics, make up a large proportion of those defenders who are attacked as a result of their work. But the thing that holds all of these people in common globally is a real motivation, despite differing tactics, to try and essentially prevent harm occurring to the environment.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Does anyone have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would like to add that in terms of coverage, it's really important to try to get the legal definition of what is an environmental defender in a particular country, because it's different in different situations. And sometimes there is no specific definition of what is an environmental defender in a country, and they are included in the human rights defender category. And why this is important? Because first, it will help you to establish the institution who will be responsible for handling the environmental defenders. Second, because usually countries have some kind of a registry that list all the environmental defenders or human rights defenders that are at risk. And third, because if there's a definition, if there are some kind of registry, probably it will be protocols to provide protection to environmental defenders. So it will be great to have the opportunity to check if the state is giving this kind of protection, if the protection is working, if there are environmental defenders who are waiting for protection. So it's important, for example, and it's very different. In Peru, we have a mechanism for protection for human rights defenders, and it's pretty new from 2021. But in Colombia, they have a different one. They have different levels of protection for environmental defenders. And in Ecuador, you can't find any. So it's very different, very important as a starting point for the coverage to get the legal definition of this concept.
Great. Thank you, Maria Isabel. Does anyone else have anything to add to that?
I can chime in very briefly. So for the purposes of this conversation, I will be speaking about journalists, reporters. From CPJ's perspective, we consider journalists to be, it's a wide umbrella, it's a broad definition. It's somebody who is engaged in the act of journalism. That's everyone from your freelance journalist who is riding a bike down the street telling people the news, all the way to somebody who is an international correspondent for a well-established news outlet. But I think it's important to point out here as well, for the purpose of this conversation, that when we're talking about the space of environmental defenders, we also recognize, of course, that in many countries, many parts of the world, a journalist can also be a defender and can also be an activist. And those roles can often overlap. At CPJ, when we are thinking about a journalist in this role, we're focused on their journalism. But we recognize, of course, that somebody can have multiple roles in this space.
Great. Thank you, Lucy. Milka, did you have anything to add?
Sure. Sorry, I will have to keep my video off to increase my bandwidth. But at the consortium, and just coming from the community perspective and myself being an indigenous person, I would say that leaving someone else, an outsider from ourselves, to define who a defender is often excludes the real defenders. Like in the targeted for that collective community leadership. And so they are defenders, even if they are not coming to the streets with cameras or with banners to the streets to. And so defenders really doesn't go with a specific definition that is set by anyone, either by law but it's by what people are doing to defend the keep environment away from danger. That's what I would say. So whether organized, professional or not, as long as people are contributing to the preservation of nature or keeping environment away from harm.
Great, thank you. So with that said, let's go ahead and move on to the next question. What kind of threats do defenders face, including intimidation tactics, lawsuits, etc.?
Okay, I can start. Sadly, the news that make the headlines are the murders. But the bad thing about that is that doesn't allow us to see the big picture of the vulnerability of the environmental defenders, and they're facing a very wide range of threats. And the problem also is there's no enough information about this magnitude of the threats, because are very important to follow up. Some years ago, trying to fix this situation, a group of journalists, including Mongabay Latam, we investigated this diversity of threats in 7 Latin American countries over a 10-year period. And we documented 1,356 cases of victimization, and that includes sexual violence, judicial threats, disappearances, and the important part was that 56% of the victims belong to an ethnic minority. And also, I would say that 2 threats that I consider relevant for this topic are: one, forced displacement. That is a threat that is very hard to investigate, because at this point, environmental defenders only want to disappear. They think there's no other way out, so it's very difficult to register these kind of threats. Also, criminalization. I think it has becoming more common for environmental defenders and also for journalists, especially, for example, in Latin America. Some years ago, we made a database trying to collect all this information in 4 countries, Colombia, Mexico, Ecuador, and Peru. And we documented 156 active cases. And a third of these cases belong to indigenous populations. So that is very worrying. And in terms of coverage, I would recommend to go to local organizations that have a more specific registry of this kind of diversity threat. For example, in Mexico, there is an organization called SEMDA, and they documented in 2022 582 aggressions. And the interesting fact is that almost the half of these aggressions were linked to the government. And in Colombia, the ONIC, that is an indigenous organization, documented specific threats to indigenous people that mostly is not so well known, that is confinement. What is confinement? Is kind of a curfew imposed by armed groups in Colombia. And according to ONIC, last year, 400,000 indigenous people were affected to this kind of confinement. So I think it's very important to see this diversity. These threats also are different for each group of environmental defenders, and also to consider that I believe there is a big underreporting, so we are not seeing the big picture of the vulnerability that environmental defenders are facing.
Can I add to that? I think I totally agree with Maria, and I think that one thing, as an organisation that predominantly captures data on lethal attacks, so killings of land and environmental activists globally, there are 2 things that I think are really important, and we are also trying to constantly emphasize when we release our data. The first is that, I mean, in a majority of cases where people have been killed, actually a large number of them have reported consistently over a number of years or months, as Maria said, a complete diversity of different tactics that are used to try and silence them. So killings for us are really the sharp end of the spectrum, and it's really important to, you know, I think as a journalist, beginning to engage on these this topic, and to when meeting with communities who have either, you know, been affected in the worst way possible, which is to, you know, to have a killing occur, that they are asking the kinds of questions about what are the types of actions that have already been taken, that people have already experienced beforehand. That said, we are also totally aware that our data set is an underestimate in terms of the sheer number of killings as well. There's a real leaning towards, because of the way that our methodology works, to particular regions of the world, specifically Latin America, but that really does underplay the context that is playing out and affecting you know, other regions of the world as well as Latin America, that really illustrate that there are a number of different tactics being used to keep communities quiet.
I can jump in here as well to speak about journalists specifically. And Rachel and Maria Isabel, what you've both said rings very true. So yes, there is the criminalization and an increased criminalization of journalists globally for doing their work, including those who are reporting on the environment. We sadly have seen a number of journalists who have been killed for this coverage. The most recent data that CPJ keeps on that number in particular is from 2019, when we documented 13 journalists that we know were killed for investigating damage to the environment, but that number could be as high as 29 as we continue to look into these cases. So there's threats to the journalists' livelihood, and these threats, of course, occur both physically and also online. And the digital safety aspect is something that I can get into a little bit later, but is just as important and feels just as threatening to journalists as well. There's the threat, of course, of arrest and detention. Legal threats and lawsuits is something that we pay a lot of attention to at CPJ, as it is the scale that we're seeing, it's a relatively new way of weaponizing the law against journalists with the intent, of course, to silence them. And then I think it's worth pointing out here as well that we have documented several cases of journalists who have been covering protests, particularly those against pipeline projects here in the United States as well as Canada. That comes into the legal aspect of things as well, but there are added and unique challenges that journalists face while covering protests as well.
Great, thank you very much, Lucy. It looks like we've lost Milka, but if she is able to rejoin, we'll circle back to her and ask. So with that said, let's move on to our next question. What regions or countries are particularly dangerous for defenders? And you've actually mentioned quite a few already, but what should journalists know about these regions?
Well, as you may know, Latin America ranks diverse reports of rank Latin America as the most dangerous region for environmental defenders in the world. According to Global Witness, we have that terrible honor for a lot of years. And for me, there are some countries that have shown some consistently worrying scenario. I would start with Brazil. I think there's a great vulnerability for environmental defenders in the Amazon territory. And undoubtedly, the Bolsonaro's government was a factor to promote violence to environmental defenders in the Amazon. And also the government broke down the environmental system. So it was terrible for the environmental defenders during those 4 years. Hopefully something will change now. Mexico has been in a very sad spiral of violence for a lot of years, associated, of course, to the drug trafficking problem. And the thing is that now that these drug trafficking mafias are trying to take control of different activities, agribusiness, community forestry, trying to control illegal logging, commercial routes. So it has been very dangerous for some farmers that are trying to do a sustainable work in Mexico. And it has been very dangerous for them. And I would add Colombia. As you know, in Colombia, they experience a very violent internal armed conflict. And we believe, we have the hope that when the peace agreement have been signed, we have some kind of peace. But there has been a power vacuum. And there's a lot of different factions struggling for the power in the territory. We have former guerrillas, we have paramilitaries, we have the militaries, we have drug trafficking mafias, illegal mining mafias. And between all of them, we have the communities of indigenous people, we have local communities, we have farmers trying to survive among all this violence. And finally, I will mention Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, where we also have some kind of governments that are also pushing repression, not only to environmental defenders, but also to journalists. So I would say the situation is pretty disturbing in Latin America right now.
Thank you, Maria Isabel.
I think to also move beyond Latin America, I think that again, our own statistics have consistently shown over the last decade that Latin America is a particularly dangerous region for human rights defenders as well as land and environmental defenders. And that's, I think that the statistics that are gathered not just by Global Witness but by other organizations who are collecting data on different types of reprisals should be considered when thinking about undertaking research or investigations in these areas. But I think one other way to kind of look at it, like what are the underlying trends, particularly around the operating environment? So what are the shared characteristics globally between countries in Latin America and countries in other regions of the world? And I think that then gives you a good picture as to what, where else, considering that we know that there are gaps in our knowledge and gaps in our data, where else is the environment set up to be particularly dangerous? And we show through our reporting that things like restrictions on civic space, so the lack of ability for people to speak out, restrictions on the ability for civil society to gather together, restrictions on journalism, which I'm sure Lucy can talk about. These all form part of an operating environment that are really at the core of what makes it dangerous and difficult. Inevitably, there are variations country by country in terms of, how that plays out. And Maria, went through a number of different countries in Central and South America where there are these kinds of like more nuanced differences. But I think overall, the reporting that is out there should be or can be used as a lens through which to try and understand where regions of the world it might be more difficult for defenders and also to report on them.
Thanks, Rachel and Maria Isabel. I will echo both of you in saying that, of course, Latin America is particularly dangerous. With Brazil as well, we very sadly saw last year the deaths of journalist Dom Phillips and Bruno Pereira as well. CPJ also put out a recent report on Manuel Caloquispe, who is a journalist in Peru. He reports on illegal gold mining in his hometown and detailed many of the threats that he deals with, including death threats, physical attacks, and in one case having a machete thrown at him. It's important to point out as well that as a local journalist, and local journalists wherever you are in the world tend to face bigger risks because they are living in the community that they're reporting on. They cannot just get up and leave. And so we always want to make sure that that is something people remember when talking about journalists who cover the environment. I mentioned the Americas as well. So when we have the US and Canada, and an important thing to point out there is CPJ does put out a number of legal guides, which are best practices in terms of basically knowing your rights. So if you are going to cover an environmental, protest or something like that, there are many resources available, and in many of the times that legal guidance comes in handy and is super important. Looking at the rest of the world and CPJ's reporting, earlier this year we reported on journalists across Europe, including those in Bulgaria, France, and Germany, who have faced threats and violence while reporting on environmental defenders and the environment there. And then in Asia as well, we have reported on the death of a journalist in Cambodia who was killed due to his reporting on logging, and also risks to journalists in Vietnam as well who cover this topic.
Thank you very much, everyone. That was a very, very good overview of that. So, with that said, we're going to move on to the next question here, which is what industries or sectors pose the highest level of risk, both for defenders and then also for the journalists that cover them.
I'm happy to go ahead and start here. So I was taking a look back through CPJ's archives in preparation for today, and it's a wide range of industries. So deforestation, animal poaching as well, general agribusiness, and then we've seen the pollution of rivers by mining. These are all topics that journalists have covered, and they have faced threats for doing so. A very interesting report from the Global Investigative Journalism Network, or GIJN, also pointed to construction sand and investigations into that topic that led to the deaths of 2 journalists in India. To me, that's not something I was super familiar with and would not have necessarily risen to the top of my list. So I thought that was an extremely interesting one. And of course, it goes without saying that journalists who cover the general situation facing many Indigenous communities as well, they have faced risks for their reporting too.
I can also jump in. So again, in relation to our data collection on killings, particularly of land and environmental defenders, we found that over the decade, a large number of cases are linked to individuals or communities who are speaking out against extractive industry projects. So this covers lots of the industries that Lucy talked about, so mining, agribusiness, but also includes newer sectors, the renewable sector, large-scale infrastructure projects, all of which are or have been linked to reprisals. I think the other thing that is again quite interesting to think about is whilst corporate activity is often the kind of instigator or the thing that sparks communities to begin speaking out against harms that are caused by those projects or by the businesses driving them. There's also these underlying rights that begin to become affected. So there is a wider state failure often to put people and the environment first by protecting land rights, by preventing cronyism, by limiting corruption, by failing to address the lack of civic space or restricting press freedoms. And these are some of the kind of root causes that we also document through the data collection that we do. So there is definitely a link to specific industries, often very land-based industries, so industries that require or are utilizing land in some way, which can spark communities to protest or to speak out. But it also shines a light on the state failing to protect people's rights. So there's this kind of duality in terms of like the root causes there.
Thank you very much. Sorry, are you speaking at Maria as
yes.
well? Okay.
Yes, totally agree with Rachel about this duality, about private sector and the state, and also about why all these threats are linked to private and corporate sector. I think the root cause is land, and I have an example to illustrate that. 2 years ago, we investigated the impact of oil industry in the Amazon territories of 4 countries. And we found out about, among other things, that 1,647 indigenous territories are affected by the overlap of oil block concession. And 70% of all these communities have oil blocks overlapping 100% of their territories. And that is a case that illustrates a lot of what's happening in the territory with these kind of extractive industries. And looking to the other important actor that also Rach mentioned, that is the state, a lot of threats in Latin America are linked to the state, aggressions to these different levels of the government, the police, the army. Also, when an interesting fact, when we investigated criminalization, we found out that 80% of the complaints against environmental defenders originated in conflicts with the private sector. But in half these cases, the one that denounced the environmental defenders is the state and not the private sector. So as Rachel said, I think there's a duality, and I would say that is because in some countries the state think itself like the promoter of the businesses without any environmental criteria. Is a priority for them, and that leave the indigenous communities, local communities, without any protection in the territories.
And that's actually an important point to bring up now. So what are some legal frameworks or protections that do exist for environmental defenders or whistleblowers or journalists? So the EU has adopted, for instance, a dedicated whistleblower protection legislation. So can a framework like this, happen internationally? And if so, what would need to happen for that to occur?
I would say that right now in Latin America, probably the agreement that generated the greatest expectation is the Escazú Agreement. And why has is bringing so much expectation among civil society and indigenous people? Because the treaty tried to promote access or better access to environmental information, environmental participation, also try to make sure that all the environmental rights are being really good respect by the government and the private sector, but also because the Escazú Agreement wants to address the environmental, the protection of the environmental defenders. And sadly, when the countries started to sign the Escazú Agreement, it began a very strong disinformation campaign against the treaty, especially, I would say, from the private sectors. They said that this agreement will stop investment, that will take away sovereignty from the countries. That is not a lie. But it is important, I said, ask ourselves why we need a regional treaty if we have environmental national laws. And I would say that is the importance of the Escazú Agreement, because we have to recognize that we need to address all these problems on a regional basis. Countries doesn't have the same standards related to environmental defenders' rights, as I said before. We don't have the same standards related to environmental laws. So the idea is that regional treaty try to put some kind of parameters to protect environmental defenders, to protect the environment. And I think that hasn't been very well welcomed by some sectors, but hopefully it could be a great opportunity to address these problems and to try to find regional solutions instead of only particular experiences in some countries.
I'll build on that if that's okay. I totally agree with Maria. I think that thinking about the types of legislation that exist that can work to protect defenders can be thought of at a local level, a national level, and an international level, regional being in there as well. I think that depending on where you were working or what you were doing, like inevitably a lot of defenders will talk about, actually there are local measures that are being taken by local government units or departments that work in their favor. So again, this kind of these measures may be addressing the broader and underlying reasons for them speaking out. So it can be some countries that have very good rights or around land rights, very good protection for indigenous peoples, actual some national mechanisms to actually protect human rights defenders. There can be, or there are cases and examples of countries that have or are bringing in due diligence mechanisms for corporations. So again, to kind of, as Maria was saying, standardize how corporates are thinking about human rights and environmental due diligence. But in terms of like actual mechanisms that are established for land and environmental defenders, as well as the Escazú Agreement, there are the kind of UN Special Procedure communications. There's the role of UN Special Rapporteurs, who do have some power to raise cases with states and companies, particularly where there have been harms to human rights and the environment. And I think that these kinds of mechanisms, whilst they're not all binding, do provide an avenue through which local communities and activists can begin to raise their cases, and they do act as a form of protection even if they are not, even if they are not specifically designed as a protection measure.
I'm going to jump in really quickly from the journalist side of this. And while there is no kind of set mechanism to protect environmental journalists or journalists who cover environmental defenders. There are some countries that do have federal protection mechanisms for journalists, and I will mention Mexico as an interesting example. Maria Isabel mentioned Mexico earlier as kind of a case study country for where it's quite difficult for environmental defenders. And while this federal protection mechanism exists, it has unfortunately essentially failed, given that journalists in Mexico are being killed at quite alarming rates, and were last year among the top country for journalists being killed globally. So it's a question of whether these actually work. It's good that it's there, but if it can't actually do the job of protecting a journalist, we may need to think about other solutions.
Thank you very much, everyone. So moving on to our next question, what are some examples of stories in which the coverage of an environmental defender or their work led to positive impact, whether it was to, helping to secure land rights, environmental protection, increased government or corporate transparency or accountability, or all of the above?
Well, we as news media, as a civil organization, we trying to contribute to make these problems visible. But I would say that what always surprises me is the capacity of the environmental defenders to fight for their rights, for their land, with so much perseverance, at the cost of their lives. So a lot of examples, I would say that they get what they get because of this struggle for so many years. And I have a story that I like a lot that happened in Peru. It's my country. I'm a Peruvian journalist, and it happened in Loreto. There's this movement in indigenous communities to try to protect their territory, forming this kind of brigades of environmental monitors, guardian of the territories, and they are doing a terrific job resisting land grabbing, resisting criminal mafias, resisting illegal miners at the cost of their lives. For example, in Brazil, the Guajajara leaders that died were environmental monitors. And in Peru, we have a territory that has a long history of oil spills, Loreto. But as usually happens, the state didn't want to recognize the magnitude of the oil spills. So the indigenous communities, a lot of indigenous communities, create a group of 60 environmental monitors. And the environmental monitors went to the territory and identified 500 points of contamination. They photographed the contamination, videotape it, georeference them, and with all this evidence, with all of course, press coverage, with a lot of protest from the indigenous communities. Finally, the government passed a law to create a $5 million fund to restore the territory. But it was a very long struggle to get that. And during the process, the indigenous leaders were sued. The communities have to live near oil spills and polluted rivers, but they finally have this victory that is still in process because, of course, the government is putting some difficulties to start using this fund to restore the territories. And I think we just witnessed a very interesting success from the environmental defenders in Yasuní. In Yasuní, in Ecuador, the people has voted to stop oil extraction in this biodiversity hotspot. And that was the victory and the success from indigenous communities, from a group of environmental defenders that has been trying to do this consultation for 10 years. And it was a very, very long process to finally get this election. So I think it's the combination of press coverage, but also the perseverance, the and the courage of the environmental defenders to continue these fights that sometimes seems that they can win, but they manage to get some victories during this struggle.
Thank you very much, Maria. Isabel.
I was going to say, I think in addition to that, you know, a lot of the examples that Maria gave are really illustrative of the way that the media can play a role in amplifying the work that is already being done by local communities. But if you think about, you know, what happens to what has happened to individuals in terms of the reprisals that they face, from our reporting again shows that there's a large number of defenders who face reprisals, particularly killings. There is a real lack of justice for them and for their families as a result. So I was really thinking about this question because I think there are two ways in which media coverage can really help. You know, the first is to kind of actually drive and support the cause that many communities are working for, but the second is also to shine a light on the injustice and the lack of, or the increasing impunity that communities face when attacks do occur, whether that be non-lethal attacks, criminalization, threats, harassment, or in the worst case, killings. And actually, there are very few cases that we come across, sadly, where there has been the arrest and the sentencing of the perpetrators of reprisals. That, you know, the most the most kind of, I guess, one of the most high profile cases that I can think of, and they are few and far between, is the case of Berta Cáceres from Honduras. And it was only in 2021, a number of years after she was killed, that you had the arrest and sentencing of somebody for her murder. And so I think that media can play a role both in supporting the actual goals and advocacy of local groups, as well as also shining a light on the injustices that occur and the growing and increasing lack of impunity for those that have faced reprisals themselves.
I would like to add to what Rachel said, that I have a successful story that was a successful story until last week, and that portrays something that Rachel said about impunity and the time that environmental defenders need to get some kind of justice. It was the Soweto case in Peru. The 4 indigenous leaders were killed by illegal loggers in an Amazonian territory in Peru. And the widows asked for justice for 9 years. I think there was press coverage. They were threatened again and again in their territories. Finally, they got a conviction. And last week, the conviction was overturned. So the 4 illegal loggers are now free. And of course, the widows are afraid for their lives. So impunity, I would say, is one of the most important topic that we as journalists should address. We don't know what's happening. In Mongabay, we made an investigation about impunity, and I believe we managed to count 58 indigenous leaders in 4 Amazonian countries that were killed, and from them, in 7 years, only not even 8 of these cases are being dealt in the Justice Court. The other 50, nothing happened. So it's a very difficult situation for environmental defenders, because I believe the perpetrators think they can do whatever they want and nothing is going to happen in these countries.
I want to give Lucy a chance to respond, or Milka. Right now, we're examining what are some examples of stories in which press coverage had a positive impact for environmental defenders or indigenous or local communities or journalists or environmental protection. So, Lucy, I'm going to give you a chance to respond, and Milka, if you have anything to add to this question, feel free after Lucy.
Thanks, Mike. The two examples given were fantastic, and I'd actually like to just respond on the impunity point, because this lack of impunity and these quite shocking statistics really mirror what we see at CPJ and when we're talking about press freedom. So we know that, for example, in the case of journalists, 8 out of 10 cases of journalists killed have impunity, meaning there is no justice and their perpetrators have not been brought to justice. As Maria Isabel rightly said, this creates an environment of fear. It creates an environment that encourages the silencing of journalists. It makes colleagues, family members, friends, those who also cover this topic, extremely afraid. And we know that there have been cases of impunity with journalists who have covered the environment as well. So I just wanted to point out that the situation involving impunity is massively important, and illustrates a much more worrying trend that we see both in the world of environmental defenders and journalists who cover them as well.
Great, thank you so much, Lucy. Milka, did you have anything to add before we move on to the next question? I'll come back to her and see if she has anything on the next one. So, moving on to the next question. So, you started to talk about some other threats. Impunity, one of them, which you just covered. But what are some examples of threats that often don't make headlines but need more attention? So, anything that we haven't mentioned yet that you want journalists to examine more of?
I said impunity. We are all agree that is one important thing to investigate, and linked to impunity, of course, corruption, and trying to make the connection between the perpetrators and the one that hired those perpetrators, because sometimes there's something with power behind those people. The other topic I would say that is very, very important is criminalization. We need more information about this. We need to know more about what's happening in the justice system, and also what is the role of the state and the private sector by criminalizing journalists and environmental defenders. Also, I would say that we need to, it's not a threat, but I would say that we need to communicate better the situation of the vulnerability of environmental defenders in their territory. We have this diversity of threats, but also we have these indigenous communities, these local communities surrounded by diverse types of criminal mafias. We have drug trafficking mafias, we have illegal mining, we have deforestation, we have pollution. And I believe we are not portraying that big picture of what's going on the territory. And it's very important to understand why it's so difficult for environmental defenders to live in those places and why they are resisting so hard this kind of situation. Also, I think that a very important topic is to try to investigate what is happening with the protection that the government should give to the environmental defenders. There are some kind of systems to protect environmental defenders from the state, but they are not working. Sometimes because there's corruption, there is a system that allows us not to work, but also we have to think that it's very difficult to protect environmental defenders in these big territories. So we need to think, to ask the authorities to have a better way to protect them, because at some point, I feel sometimes we are journalists that we are covering this for so long that we are like losing the battle, that we are only counting death after death and nothing is going to change. So we have to find the way to make the state accountable for this death in some point, as that it should be stopped.
If I can chime in on the threats that often don't make headlines but need more attention in terms of journalists and journalist safety. The one thing that's quite difficult to report on because it is so prevalent is online harassment and abuse. At CPJ, we view journalist safety in kind of three main buckets, those being physical safety, digital safety, and psychosocial safety or your mental health. But because we know that many environmental defenders as well as journalists will receive a lot of harassment online, and this can be very threatening. It can be very, in a real life setting, very scary and can work towards silencing journalists and violating press freedom as well. The prevalence of it, the scale, it means it's not always reported on because it's almost expected at this point. So it makes it quite difficult to make headlines. But we know that those online threats can and do formulate into a real life harm, and that's just one thing I'd like to highlight here because it is a real problem.
Thank you very much for pointing that out, Lucy. Rachel, do you have anything to add before we move on?
No, it's both Lucy and Maria have covered everything I would have said. I think, I won't go over it, but I think the new term that I heard the other day was lawfare, and I think that very accurately describes some of the mechanisms that are being used to underpin attacks on defenders. So I would add that in, like that particularly criminalization is not so obvious. It's often a different range of legal mechanisms and laws that are being misused to target, and so drawing links between what those particular laws are and attacks is incredibly important.
Just note, we are experiencing some difficulties with Milka's connection. So if she rejoins, I will loop her back into the conversation. But I'm going to move on to the next question. So this is a pretty important one. When reaching out to a source for a story, what are some of the most important safety considerations journalists need to be evaluating before contacting a source, or even before beginning research on a story?
I'm happy to start with this one because we actually at CPJ have an entire safety resource on this very topic. So the most important step a journalist can take before even beginning their reporting is to undergo a risk assessment. This does not have to be something that takes hours. It does not have to be something that is laborious in any way. Rather, it should be thought of as an opportunity to ideally speak to a colleague or ideally your editor about all the risks that you may encounter on this story. And your interactions with sources should absolutely come into this as well. And Mike, you said at the top of the webinar that obviously we're providing some general guidance here and that journalists can and should have real conversations with their editors before reporting, and that's absolutely true. And of course, there are country-specific considerations as well. And the advice differs if you are a journalist going into a community to report versus being a journalist who is already living in and part of that community as well. So when you're planning your story and you are reaching out to sources, you really need to consider who the source is. Have they spoken to the media before? What is their role within the community? Are they an activist themselves? Has this presented a problem for them in the past? And very, very importantly, are they themselves at risk? Have they themselves faced threats because of their work? And is your being in touch with them as a journalist going to put them at greater risk or you at greater risk as well? All of this is to say that you should take time evaluating the source and evaluating those safety considerations as well. And I think it goes without saying that you should never assume that a source is comfortable being named without their explicit permission. And that is an ongoing conversation. It's not just a one-time thing. We're talking about reporting in stories that are very high risk, that have a lot of financial and powerful interests involved. It can be very risky for a source to speak to you. And so basically having very open communication with them about their willingness to be named or identified is really important. quickly as well, when considering who your source is and you're going to start that communication with them, ideally you would use confidential encrypted communication using WhatsApp or Signal where necessary. Depending on the risk to you, to the source and the story that you're working on, you may wish to consider a separate phone to talk to your source, and you may wish to save their name under a pseudonym. Why do this? It's because if you're there in the community and your phone is searched by authorities and they're looking through and they can clearly identify who you've been speaking to, it puts them at risk. So always thinking through these things. Assume that your phone or your device will be searched, and kind of make it as blank as possible as well. We have a lot of digital safety recommendations that I believe will be shared after this webinar, but whenever you're reporting, it's following those digital safety best practices as well. This will only bolster your safety and the safety of your source too.
Thank you very much, Lucy.
What Lucy said about giving us the time to reflect about these topics, because sometimes when we are covering these sensitive topics, we are very urgent to publish and we need a lot of time to reflect while we are on the field, if we are approaching some sources, the pictures that we are going to use, that we explain carefully to a source or to an indigenous leader or to a community leader what will mean to be in our publication. Because sometimes also, even if they are on the record, they perhaps haven't noticed what will happen if they are in this publication. So we have to be very careful with that. And also I would like to add some suggestion when leading with indigenous organization. There's some different levels in indigenous organization, and we try to touch. We need to try to touch base with these different level because they're different and they need to be addressed to have the big picture of what's going on the territory. We have national organization. Is a good starting point for getting some background, some context. We have regional and local organization. They have more specific information about the territory. And then each community has a leader that we have to contact to know if we can go to the field. We can't go to a community without previous organization. We need to see if we can approach the source. We have to remember that they are under threat. So if they talk with a journalist, it could be dangerous. If we go to a community that is surrounded by illegal mafias, it will be dangerous not only for the journalists, but for the community, because they have to be there after the journalists went to the city. So it's very important to be very reflective, very prudent when dealing with these sensitive topics.
I wanted to add 2 more points, if that's okay. Again, 2 things that come to mind from my own experience working with defenders globally, and it is different to the work that a journalist does. There are some components of Global Witness's work which is very journalistic, but we're also a campaigning organisation, and so we are confronted with or work with people often on a much longer term basis, and it's really that longer term or that longevity that I want to kind of just touch upon, because I think risk assessments, obviously, I agree with everything my colleagues have said, but one thing that really comes to light for me is that we are often working and speaking with people who are in the heart of the situation, and a risk assessment doesn't always address the longevity of attacks that they are facing. So these are people that have lived with threats hanging over them for months or for years, and actually considering that as part of your relationship and your risk assessment is really quite important, because in the digital age that we live in, you put something out, it goes up online, and then it's there forever, and essentially you know, as a journalist, you at some point walk away from that story and from that individual, but that story remains there, and it can therefore influence and affect that individual's you know, safety for a much longer period of time. You know, it can come back in a few months' time, in a few years, and be part of that. You know, be something that essentially can increase risks to them in the long term. So I think like understanding that these are individuals that are going to be in these situations for a very long time, that there is a longevity, and building that into your risk assessment would be incredibly important. I also want to come back to something Lucy said earlier in response to another question, which is about well-being. And I think that that's often also not built into risk assessments in the same way. So, you know, again, from my experience working with defenders, often I think that they are some of the most, they have some of the a really high risk appetite, and actually, it's really important to think about the fact that they, you know, they themselves living in these environments and being confronted with, you know, security concerns every day don't often view it like that. And so asking the right questions about, well, how do you go about your day-to-day life? Like, what are the kinds of things that you do? They, you know, do you kind of, you know, lock up every day? Do you, you know, check down the road before you go out? These are things that are very normalized, and actually it can be very difficult to draw these kind of very natural risk or precautionary measures that people take, because it becomes so normal. And so I think, yeah, there's an element of like thinking about the longevity of security risks that people face, thinking about their well-being generally and their ability to really engage in some of these topics. Again, you know, this is a daily occurrence for many, and yeah, thinking about trying to kind of draw out and have a common language for how risk is talked about, because I think that can differ from, you know, person to person and across communities.
Yeah, I totally agree with Rachel, because as she said, sometimes leaders, environmental defenders are taking risky decisions, and and as I said, sometimes they want to be on the record, and they give they talk about what's happening in the territory, and it's great for the peace, great for the publication, but we have to go beyond that. We have to think in what's going to happen after the publication, and also what is our responsibility as journalists. I always ask the journalists that go on the field, that try to build the story without the environmental defenders being the main part of the story, that we can keep them and still be able to set what is going on the territory, because we need to protect them. We need to respect their decision of being on the record, of course, but we have to have the time to explain a lot, to explain to them what is going to happen. And also, two more things. I think as journalists, we need to keep the communication open with those sources, with those sources after the publication. And also, it is very important to know which authority to contact if someone told us that has received threats. That is very important to try to get some protection for them.
I just want to point out that two audience members asked specifically how they can minimize risk to sources, how to protect sources and ensure their safety. And we've just spent a pretty good amount of time outlining some of those. We are going to move on to another one, which is digital security. It's a really large concern when communicating with sources. And we're going to, link some tools in the show notes that from the CPJ that will expand on that. But however, as technology continues to evolve, what are some of the most important security concerns that journalists should be aware of right now?
I'm happy to start this one. And that's great that there have been two questions specifically about source protection. And again, there is a resource for that. And I hope it's very, very useful. So before we get to talk about digital safety, not only do we view safety in these three buckets, physical, digital, and psychosocial, or your mental health, but also these stages of a story. And I think everyone has touched on this as well, but you have that pre-assignment planning, you have that during the assignment piece, and then after the publication as well. So we have a section on CPJ's website that is a dedicated page for the risks that face journalists who undergo environmental reporting. And what's very interesting is to see the safety resources that we have put on that page, because they apply to journalists in many contexts, but including those who are reporting on the environment. So that would be the risks of arrest and detention, which have physical and digital safety risks, protecting confidential sources as well, which we've spoken a little bit about, and then working with adversarial sources as well. So you are involved in the reporting of a story, you do your due diligence and you seek comment from an individual or an organization who doesn't want to speak to you. That then creates risks, because then that organization or individual knows that you're reporting and they may not want you to do that. Therefore, your kind of threat level has gone up. On that digital safety piece, then we've already spoken a little bit about some of the communication aspects, the advice to use encrypted communication when necessary. I will say a little bit about something that seems very basic, but for journalists and I think environmental defenders is super important, which is your social media hygiene and what is out there about you on the internet. As Rachel correctly pointed out, once a story is out there, it's there forever. And the same thing goes to what you post. So here in the US, at least, there are ways that there are programs you can use to basically take down your personal information from the internet. Here there are programs such as Delete Me or others. They may be named differently in other countries, but there is a lot of personal information about you on the internet that you may not realize is even there. And the wider point here is that that information can be weaponized against you by bad actors and by people who don't really want you to continue this reporting. So prevention is the key here, and doing as much as you can to basically take down anything that could personally harm you, meaning personal email, personal phone number, your address, names, addresses, phone numbers of family members and friends, that kind of thing. We are also increasingly worried about digital surveillance and then the use of spyware as well. That's something at CPJ that we spend quite a bit of time thinking about and reporting on. This goes back to that question of device security and making sure you are smart with your devices. If you have an iPhone and you are working on a particularly high risk story, there is the lockdown mode option as well, which we have written about in resources on our website too. Finally, on that digital safety piece, one thing to consider with all of this as well is just the weaponization of mis and disinformation, particularly around climate coverage. But it's just another way that people who don't like your reporting can use this against you and create a problem for you. I will stop there on the digital safety piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Rachel or Maria, Isabel, do you have anything to add?
No, I think for me, CPJ are the authority on this. That was incredibly comprehensive.
Yeah, my suggestion will be that we need to go to experts. We as journalists, we really don't know a lot of the new texts, the new spywares. Sometimes we don't take this seriously because we think that it's not going to happen to me. And it's happening in every country. So the basic, at least we have to do it strong, two-step password verification, use Signal and not WhatsApp. It seems like basic, but still you can find some journalists not doing these basic recommendations. So I suggest strongly to go to experts, to ask for advice, and to try to avoid these threats that are terrible for the journalists in a lot of countries.
I'll just make another. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I would just very quickly like to make another plug here for risk assessments. Rachel, you are very correct in that it's not one size fits all. That longevity piece should absolutely be a part of it, but there can be in there a specific section on digital safety and digital security, where you go through your devices, you take out any kind of personal identifying information, any documents that might put you or your sources at risk. Again, it's an opportunity to just have a moment to think and breathe and go through any potential risks with the express aim of preventing something bad from happening. Thank you.
Yes, and I would just like to note that we're placing the digital safety toolkit in the show notes of this webinar, which I highly encourage you to access. So we're bringing this round to the final stage, which is something that you mentioned here, Lucy, which is what happens after a story is published. So it's important to consider all these risks before and during, but after it has been published, what are some of the safety and legal concerns that journalists should be aware of? And depending on the situation, what actions, if any, should a journalist take?
Yes, I'm really glad that we've kind of already touched on post-publication, but I think one of the very basic things for journalists, editors, newsrooms to know is that there are risks attached to the post-publication timeframe. So just knowing that will again allow you to prepare and plan accordingly. So I think we've said it already, but it's worth saying again. There is big money to be made in environmental destruction, and people have a very vested interest in many cases in your story not being published. And additionally, as Maria Isabel said, it may be the first time that local activists or members of the Indigenous community that you're reporting on have been named or have been put in the spotlight. And this may reignite threats against them, cause new threats. So you need to be prepared that might happen. Remember that the local journalist, the source, the defender, that you as potentially an international or outside journalist are covering, they are always usually left there and you can leave. And so you want to double, triple, quadruple check that before publication, your sources are comfortable being named or identified. If their minds change, that's okay. And you may also wish to identify a place or a safe house or a location that particularly at-risk sources may be able to go to if they do receive very difficult threats after publication. If you know or you envision that your piece, your video, your podcast, your radio piece may trigger legal threat or legal action, it's worth being in touch, ideally with a lawyer or legal organization ahead of time. I will make a plug here for something called the Legal Network for Journalists at Risk. This is an umbrella organization that brings together many press freedom organizations. But one of the things that they do is they can connect journalists and newsrooms to legal representatives who can do a pre-publication review. So that's something to consider, because it means that you've kind of taken that step to protect yourself. Okay, there's nothing in here that people could take issue with. And if they do, then we can escalate. Finally, I will just say again that preparation here is absolutely key. But if something does happen, it is always worth contacting an organization like CPJ or another press freedom organization to say, hi, I am reporting on this. I'm worried about threats that might come my way. I'm letting you know as a watchdog organization, as an organization that has people around the world, so that you can document and report it and then shed light on those threats if they do occur.
Yeah, I also think we have to be very strategic, because we are in countries where we have very weak institutions. We don't trust in justice. So in these cases, you can have a very good publication very well documented, and still you are going to be sued. So you have to be prepared for that, because I always see journalists that say, but I'm right. Yes, but the people that you are denouncing have a lot of power, have a lot of money, and they can give you a hard time for 1, 2, 3 years with legal costs and a process that is terrible for your mental health, for your family. So you have to be very strategic. As Lucy said, you have to look for legal advice. There's a lot of news media now that are asking for legal review before publication, because sometimes there are some terms that are very specific. So it's good that a lawyer can see you before you publish. It is different, the point of view. And also to look for people or organization like Lucy, that could give you some kind of support, so you don't feel terrible when you get sued or anything, because it's very difficult for the journalists. I saw them, there's a lot of pressure to not to go to the jail, because that's a reality. So we have to be very strategic. Remember that this is a process that you don't have to go through alone. Try to talk to your editor, try to talk to more people. So it's not the pressure only for you, but to your team also. So
I'd add one thing just on legal threat. I think it's also very important to consider that you as journalists might be based in Europe or the UK. You might have a source that is based somewhere else, and then you might have a company that you're reporting on in relation to a harm that's caused that's located somewhere else. And so actually it's quite important to triangulate that kind of those locations and the different risks that are or concerns that may arise in different jurisdictions. And so keeping that front of mind is also quite important, particularly when thinking about, if a libel case is brought against you, it could be brought in the UK or the Europe, it could be brought where the source is based, it could be brought where the company is based. And so that creates another layer of complication for journalists, particularly trying to report on this. So it's one thing just to keep in mind, particularly around legal concern. And the other is, again, the role in which public exposure plays in also acting as a positive thing when confronted with legal risk. It isn't a given that kind of media and public exposure is going to act as a protection. And there are unfortunately cases of defenders who, despite having a very, very international public profile, have gone on to face very serious reprisals as a result of their work. But I think that this can, the thinking about particularly some of the legal roads that could be taken against you as a journalist, like having more options for publicizing your work later down the line can actually act as a barrier against people bringing legal cases or slap suits against you. So publication and media coverage can be something that is incredibly useful and is a tool. It can sometimes also be the thing that is bringing you into the spotlight and is creating the risk in the first place. But I think thinking about the reason I bring this up is I think encouraging both yourself and your sources to think about what are my options if a case is brought against me, particularly a legal case. Like, what are my networks? Like, who else can I rely on to amplify the message once a publication is out? And we talked about some of the mechanisms that are open to communities and environmental defenders. There are a number of different UN special rapporteurs that can further raise the profile, increase the publicity of individuals, and they all act, or being aware of those options post publication is incredibly useful.
All right, everyone. I want to go ahead and move on to our audience Q&A, because that was all the questions we had. We actually answered about 2 or 3 audience questions in there already with some of what you said. But if anyone had any other questions for our panelists, we'd love to hear them. Feel free to share, or if there's anything else that you wanted us to expand upon. A lot of you joined from all over the globe for this webinar, so it's really inspiring to see everyone. So feel free to share any questions you have. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, was there anything, panelists, was there anything that you didn't get a chance to touch upon that you were wanting to go back and say something about? Because now would be a pretty good time to re-examine something.
Well, I have a reflection that is for journalists, because we are constantly writing about these problems, and I have heard from some indigenous leaders, social leaders, that they don't like when they are being portrayed as victims, because of course they are in a very in a context of vulnerability. They are surrounded by crime. They are being invaded. They are being criminalized, but still they are trying to do something about it. They are fighting against this at the cost of their lives. So something they don't like, this narrative of being portrayed as victims. So I think it's something that we as journalists can reflect on it, and how we can balance our coverage between just the victimization, but also not being so not that we consider the vulnerability. So it's a very difficult balance. We always struggle when we are doing these kind of stories, trying to give them the appropriate value to what they are doing on the field, because they are also having some victories. They are also having some important accomplishment they want to share. So it's something that we have to discuss when we are going to publish a story like this about these sensitive topics.
That was a great point, Maria Isabel. Thank you for bringing that up. Well, I'm not seeing any additional audience questions come in. I mean, we did cover a few that folks had tacked on there. So that concludes this pretty important discussion. I just want to say thank you to our panelists here for providing, their expertise and their insight on this very important and sensitive topic. And once again, please do always work with your editors. We will be placing resources in the show notes for you to look at. But once again, I would just like to reiterate that when you're working on stories of any kind of risk or sensitive nature, you should be working with the editors in your newsroom. So we really appreciate everyone who joined here. Oh, that's right. I wanted to give Rachel had one plug that she wanted to say. Rachel, go ahead and mention your report that you're going to release.
Yeah, sorry about that, Mike. I just wanted to let everybody know that's watching that at Global Witness, we're releasing our Defenders Annual Report on the 13th of September, which is next week. If any journalists want to cover the report or wish to see an embargo copy or our press release, then please get in touch with my colleague, Evie Calder. So that's Calder at globalwitness.org. Calder spelled Calder.
Thank you very much. Also, I just want to list to anyone who's interested in doing any reporting on deforestation. An organization we collaborate with quite a bit is Global Forest Watch. So if they're going to be hosting a webinar on how to do reporting using their platform. So if you're new to environmental and journalism, or you're looking to expand your data toolbox and you want to learn more ways to incorporate their platform into your work, this webinar is something you should really check out. So I'll be linking that in the show notes as well for you to join. It's going to be on the 14th of September. Again, if you have any ideas that you'd like to pitch to us, you can do so at our opportunities page at mongabay.org. Find the SRP that most closely matches with your story idea and send us your pitch. And please do also sign up for our occasional email newsletter, which shares new paid reporting and opportunities and job openings with us. You can also subscribe and become a part of our growing newsletter community and get information on our latest offerings and webinars there. But I also just recommend that you follow us on our YouTube channel here. And you can get updates about all the work that we're releasing here on LinkedIn, Threads, Mastodon, Blue Sky. And many other social platforms out there. It always seems like they're changing these days, but we're making an effort to get on there. So thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mike.